I travel a lot and collect the scariest, creepiest, mystical, and strangest stories from people's lives. Every new episode I record in my journal of horrors. Welcome to the world of events that exist every day around you, but you don't even suspect. The door was being knocked loudly and persistently. It was a sound that couldn't be ignored. Sharp, insistent, and almost desperate. "Open up, we need to talk." A voice came from behind the door. "No, Alex, no," Tony replied. "We buried you yesterday, you can't be here." Tony was on the verge of hysteria. The shock of his best friend's voice seemed to paralyze him. Emotions merged in a tumultuous wave. Fear, despair, panic. He felt nauseous, not understanding what was happening. Somewhere a mobile phone rang. "Just open the door," Alex insisted. "Open this damn door." His voice sounded unnatural, as if an endless echo of the past had invaded his vocal cords. The sounds that Alex uttered were strange, and not characteristic of him. His voice vibrated with fury, and was filled with undisguised irritation. It was clear that it was Alex's voice. Tony would recognize it even in a crowd of thousands, but there was something wrong with it. The door was fiercely knocked on again. "I personally saw the coffin lid close, Alex," Tony blurted out. "I saw your pale face, your motionless pale lips. You were wearing a black suit, damn it." "You always hated those kinds of suits." Tony's voice trembled, tears streaming down his face. "But this time, the suit fit you perfectly, buddy. As if death itself invited you to dance your last dance. And you met her like a true gentleman. Don't be foolish, Tony. Stop stalling. Open the door." The mobile phone rang again with a piercing melody. Tony paid no attention to it, unable to believe what was happening. He sat on the floor next to the door, hugging his knees. He was trembling. Cold air seeped through the gap between the door and the floor. It was the cold of the grave, the cold of death. He knew it for sure. Suddenly, fingers from one hand protruded from under the door. They were ugly, blackened, and dry. As if trying to grasp something, they moved quickly. Some fingers were missing nails, but those that remained created an even more repulsive impression. Rough, cracked, with torn pieces, dark blue in color. These fingers were like a direct embodiment of death, of lost life and the inevitable finitude of existence. Tony silently watched them with huge, horrified eyes. He remembered Alex's friendly touches, the warmth of his hands. He remembered how much they had gone through together. They met in elementary school and overcame many difficulties together. Always supporting each other, they became not just friends, but true kindred spirits. Their bond was so strong that no obstacle could separate them. Their understanding and trust were immeasurably strong. Now, looking at these human-like rotten fingers, Tony realized that all of this was just distant fragments of what he knew and loved. "This damned accident. It's his fault in everything. He took away my best friend forever," Tony thought with rage. The lifeless fingers quickly retreated back to the other side of the door. Complete silence fell, as if the whole world held its breath. Nothing disturbed this tranquility, as if time had stopped for a moment. Gathering his strength, the guy slowly stood up, leaning his back against the wall. His body wouldn't obey. Trying not to make the slightest sound, he carefully took a step towards the door. Tony reached out his trembling hand to the peephole and pushed back the thin metal cover. Holding his breath and biting his lips, he timidly brought his head closer to the door and pressed against the opening. For the first couple of seconds, Tony's eyes tried to adjust to the distortion of the lens and focus. As soon as it happened, the young man gasped. He saw his best friend standing in pitch darkness in front of the door. Alex stood motionless, his head hanging down. His cheeks were sunken, and his skin had a dirty blue color, occasionally turning brownish black. In some areas of the skin, signs of decay and decomposition were clearly visible. Suddenly, something white appeared in the area of his nose. It was moving and wriggling, growing in size, gradually crawling out of the nostril. It was a disgusting, slimy larva. Alex's lower jaw dropped, opening his mouth, and dozens of small white creatures started crawling out of it. They were maggots that had already started devouring his body from the inside. Some of them crawled on Alex's cheeks, his neck, and hair. Others simply fell down. With incredible horror, Tony noticed that the dead man raised his head. His eye sockets were infinitely black and empty, devoid of any life. Alex, or what was left of him, seemed to be looking at Tony with an immobile and silent gaze, as if a pensive ghost was contemplating his past life. "Open this damn door!" Alex suddenly screamed, demonstrating fury and despair. The sound of the impact echoed through the room, reflecting his anger and determination. He relentlessly pounded on the door. Tony fell to the floor. His body trembled with fear, and his hands were cold and sweaty. His eyes were wide open as he helplessly stared at the door, behind which stood his best friend, or rather, his dead best friend. The young man crawled back a bit. Sharp pain pierced his temples. With each passing second it grew, becoming more and more unbearable. The tingling turned into a cruel, dull ache, surging wave after wave. The ringing in his ears was so loud that Tony could barely hear his own thoughts. With each blow to the door, his head was ready to explode from the agony. He wanted it all to end. He couldn't bear it anymore. Suddenly, the pounding on the door stopped. Silence fell around, and the pain ceased to be so vivid. Tony sat there empty and lonely in his small apartment. It didn't last long. Through the stream of noisy, continuous, and rather disjointed thoughts, he heard a new sound. A sound that made his blood freeze in his veins. A sound that was mundane and ordinary, but wild and unthinkable in this situation. The sound of running water. Someone had turned on the tap in his bathroom. He crawled on all fours toward the bath. Every inch of this path seemed like torture to him, as if he was traversing miles of scorching sand. The door to the bathroom was closed, just as before. The guy stopped in front of the door. Fear settled deep in his soul. He listened to the sound of water, a sound that seemed louder to him than the roar of the stormiest tempest. Tony sighed wearily, gathering his courage. He rose from the floor and slowly reached out his hand to the door handle. His heart was pounding furiously. Suddenly, the doorknob began to rapidly turn. Someone was pulling it forcefully, trying to open the door from the other side. A furious pounding echoed as the dead person relentlessly hammered on the door, each strike yanking it even harder. "Open the door!" Alex yelled from the bathroom. The door, and seemingly all the walls around it, trembled and shook as if under an unimaginable force. "You must open for me!" A voice came from the opposite side. Tony sharply turned around. The same thing was happening with the bedroom door. Alex, or whoever it was pulling the doorknob and trying to open the door. Somewhere, the mobile phone rang again. Its sound, like a piercing howl in the night, intensified the eerie atmosphere. At that very moment, the dead person started pounding on the front door. Tony was surrounded by a cacophony that pressed against his ears and penetrated deep into his consciousness. The sound of the mobile phone, the pounding on the door, the sound of water, everything merged into one ceaseless, insane echo. "Enough, Alex, I beg you to stop," Tony pleaded. "You're dead, buddy, you're dead." To the voice of Alexa coming from the front door, another one joined. "Open the door," he repeated the same. "Can you hear me?" Tony groaned. He wanted all of this to end as soon as possible. It tortured him. He closed his eyes and pressed his fingers to his temples, his head splitting apart. It was unbearable. "Enough, enough," he whispered. Suddenly, at that very moment, something inexplicable burst in his head. As if an invisible bubble film that filled the space of his mind could not withstand the tension. Long-awaited relief came. "We're opening the door." A tall policeman in a uniform with a silver badge on his chest entered the apartment, followed by Alex. They passed by Tony and headed to the room. "Oh no," Alex sighed. "Do you confirm the identity of Anthony Williams?" the policeman asked him. "Yes, it's him," Alex replied. Tony watched as both men leaned over his motionless body lying on the floor. How fragile the matter of our reality is, Tony suddenly thought, watching them from the side. And what an evil game my own brain started. Although no, it wasn't a game at all. It was the fear of death, intertwined with desperate attempts of my mind to regain my consciousness through shock therapy, consisting of terrible images and visions. My brain clung to life in every possible way. In the face of death, it stretched my last minutes of life into hours, maybe even days. I can only guess how long I've been lying here dead. Or was it all a wild mixture of hallucinations and prophecies that Alex would definitely look for me, would try to save me? But what difference does it make where reality is and where fiction is? The eternity of a moment is equal to the moment of eternity. Tony seemed to understand everything, absolutely everything about life and death. Everything became crystal clear, and there were no more questions about the essence of existence. But what irony and mockery of fate to choke on a piece of stuck hamburger in solitude in an empty apartment. The very fatal accident that took away my best friend, he thought. However, in this horrible absurdity at first glance is the whole essence of life. Goodbye, friend. You will always be my best friend. These were his last thoughts. Every year, thousands of people lose their lives due to objects getting stuck in their throats. In 2021, there were approximately 5,325 cases of choking-related deaths in the United States. About every 5 days, one child in the U.S. dies from choking on food, and over 12,000 children are hospitalized each year for this reason. Please find information on YouTube about how to perform the Heimlich maneuver so that you can help yourself and your loved ones in an emergency situation.